Shaquille O'Neal stepped into an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. His attire was casual, a gray t-shirt, relaxed sweatpants, and a pair of slightly worn sneakers. He looked as if he had spent the day running errands or lounging comfortably at home. Yet, despite his understated appearance, his towering presence was impossible to ignore. As he selected a modest table tucked away in a quieter corner, the warm glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the luxurious space around him. Other diners engaged in lively conversations, their laughter and the clinking of fine glassware filling the air. Before Shaq even had a chance to place an order, a waitress approached. Her sharp, scrutinizing gaze swept over him, her perfectly pressed uniform and pristine demeanor exuding an air of superiority. With a smirk curling her lips, she leaned in slightly and asked in a tone thick with condescension, "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" Her words, intentionally loud, carried across the room, reaching the ears of nearby patrons. A few turned their heads, intrigued by the unexpected interaction. What followed was something no one in the restaurant could have anticipated, an event that would challenge assumptions and leave a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. Beverly Hills, a beacon of luxury and sophistication, was home to La Lumiere, an exclusive fine dining restaurant known for its impeccable service and elite clientele. That evening, sleek sports cars lined the valet entrance as elegantly dressed guests in designer suits and flowing silk gowns stepped onto the polished floors. The restaurant gleamed with opulence, its chandeliers casting shimmering reflections across the grand glass windows. The glass doors swung open, and in walked a towering figure. Standing at over 7 feet, Shaquille O'Neal moved with a deliberate grace. His presence was magnetic, yet his outfit, a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, was a stark contrast to the polished elegance surrounding him. Those near the entrance stole subtle glances. Some recognized the basketball legend instantly, whispering amongst themselves. Others, less familiar with his legacy, simply took in his casual attire and exchanged skeptical looks. Behind the reception desk stood Emma, a young waitress whose crisp uniform and meticulous bun reflected the discipline and prestige expected at La Lumiere. She had worked at this restaurant long enough to develop a keen sense of who belonged, and, in her eyes, Shaquille O'Neal, dressed as he was, did not fit the mold. Emma's gaze lingered over his outfit for a fraction longer than necessary. Her lips pursed, and an almost imperceptible arch of her brow betrayed her thoughts. She prided herself on upholding the exclusivity of La Lumiere, and this man, despite his size and presence, didn't exude the affluence she expected. Shaq approached the reception desk, his deep voice carrying a warmth that contrasted Emma's cold demeanor. "Good evening," he said, flashing a polite smile. "I'd like to get a table if there's one available." Emma hesitated. For a split second, she seemed caught off guard by his courteous tone. But she quickly recovered, her expression shifting into one of subtle amusement. "Good evening," she replied, her voice smooth yet tinged with veiled skepticism. "This is a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you'd like to eat here?" Shaq met her gaze evenly, his smile unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to try the dining experience here." Emma tilted her head, her smirk deepening. "All right," she said with an exaggerated sigh, as if granting him a favor. "Let me check the table availability. Please wait a moment." She turned briskly, her thoughts racing. "Let's see how he reacts when he sees the menu prices," she mused. Silently, Shaq stood patiently, his eyes drifting across the grand decor of the restaurant. He had faced far greater challenges on the basketball court, this moment barely registered as an inconvenience. Yet, the subtle judgment emanating from Emma and a few nearby diners did not go unnoticed. Returning with a menu in hand, Emma gestured for Shaq to follow her. She led him through the heart of the restaurant, where tables were elegantly set under the golden glow of chandeliers. Yet, she bypassed these prime spots, guiding him instead to a dimly lit corner near the kitchen. The sounds of clattering dishes and hushed conversations from the staff filled the air, a stark contrast to the refined ambiance of the main dining area. She pulled out a chair and placed the menu on the table with a deliberate thud. "This spot should match your style perfectly," she remarked, her voice laced with mock politeness. Shaq simply nodded and took his seat, his expression unreadable. The exchange had drawn the attention of several guests. Some whispered among themselves, while others shot Emma disapproving glances. A young woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion. "That was unnecessary," she murmured, shaking her head. An older gentleman, Mr. Carter, watched with mild amusement from a table bathed in soft candlelight. He swirled his wine glass thoughtfully before commenting to his wife, "He's impressively composed." Most people would have responded by now. Emma, however, was not yet satisfied. She wanted to push further, to see him falter. With the menu still in hand, she returned to his table, this time leaning in slightly, her voice carrying a condescending lilt. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" She tapped her manicured finger on a particular dish, her tone exaggeratedly slow, as if speaking to someone unfamiliar with fine dining. "This one here is our most expensive item, $350. She watched Shaq intently, expecting some sign of discomfort, hesitation, anything that would validate her assumptions. But Shaq remained unfazed. He glanced at the menu, then back at Emma with the same calm smile. "That sounds great," he said simply. "I'll take two." The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. Eyes widened. Murmurs rippled across the room. Emma's confident smirk faltered for the first time that evening. At that moment, it wasn't just about money, it was about perception, about the judgment we pass based on appearances. And tonight, Shaquille O'Neal had effortlessly flipped the script. A gentle wave of confidence remained unshaken in Shaq's demeanor. He simply looked up, his eyes carrying a hint of amusement. "I'll have the filet mignon ricini," he said, his tone calm and composed, as if ordering the simplest dish on the menu. Emma faltered briefly. She hadn't expected him to choose the priciest dish so nonchalantly. Quickly recovering, she let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby diners. "Oh really?" she replied, her voice syrupy sweet yet laced with thinly veiled scorn. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food that everyone is accustomed to." A couple at a neighboring table whispered, "She's so rude. Why would she talk to a customer like that?" The man beside her shook his head. "She probably thinks he can't afford it." Emma remained at Shaq's table, her hand resting on the edge, waiting for a reaction. But Shaq simply smiled. "Thank you for the suggestion. I'm looking forward to trying it," he said, his polite and steady voice tinged with warmth. His composed response unsettled Emma. To her, this casually dressed man in sportswear and worn sneakers couldn't possibly grasp the true value of such a luxurious dish. Yet, without realizing it, her demeanor had already exposed her own pettiness. As she turned away, Emma deliberately raised her voice, addressing a colleague nearby. "Filet mignon ricini. He probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like that usually pick expensive items just to look fancy. But wait till the check comes, I bet he'll leave right away." Those seated, Shaq could feel the weight of all the eyes on him. Some diners looked on with sympathy, others with curiosity. Yet he showed no signs of embarrassment or discomfort. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, skimming through the other dishes with genuine interest, as if merely enjoying a culinary adventure. From the service counter, Emma continued to observe him, irritation flickering across her face at her inability to rattle him. But she also felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing she had asserted her superiority over someone she deemed out of place. In a corner of the restaurant, Mr. Carter, a distinguished older gentleman, observed the scene intently. Turning to his wife, he murmured, "He's testing everyone's patience here." "It's intriguing." The atmosphere in the restaurant grew quieter, yet an undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Shaq, still calm and unflappable, seemed not only to be savoring the experience but also preparing for something far greater, something neither Emma nor the restaurant could anticipate. Emma turned her back, a mocking smile lingering on her lips. She strode directly to the service counter and whispered to her colleague Jake, who was checking the reservation list. "He'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. People like him just pretend to be fancy. Look at this, he ordered the most expensive dish and doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. I bet he won't even make it to dessert." Jake, a young man with a kind face, looked slightly uneasy. He glanced briefly at Shaq, who was still seated in the far corner, calm as a mountain amidst the curious stares. "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience, Emma. Who knows? He might have his own reasons for coming here." Emma scoffed, shaking her head. "Reasons? Look at his outfit. Who comes to this restaurant in worn-out shoes if not to pretend?" Jake avoided her gaze, unwilling to argue. He felt uncomfortable with her behavior but knew that opposing her would only fuel her arrogance. At the corner table, Shaq sat quietly, unbothered by the murmurs behind him. He flipped through the menu leisurely, savoring every moment in the luxurious ambiance. Curious glances occasionally came his way, but Shaq met them with a gentle, untroubled smile. At a neighboring table, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, observed everything in silence. Mr. Carter, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair, slowly raised his wine glass. His eyes gleamed with understanding, as though he had witnessed countless similar stories. Lifting his glass slightly, he gave a subtle nod toward Shaq, a small but meaningful gesture. Shaq caught his gaze and returned the nod with a smile, his eyes conveying, "I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Carter leaned closer to her husband, whispering, "It's strange how they're treating someone like that. Who do you think he is?" Mr. Carter set his glass down, his eyes still fixed on Shaq. "There's something special about him, that calmness. It's not something everyone has." Across the room, Emma continued her commentary with Jake, but this time, she wasn't keeping her voice down. "See, he didn't even have a reservation. People like him just want to see if they can sneak in unnoticed. But I guarantee he'll bolt the moment he sees the total on the bill." A few diners at nearby tables glanced at Emma, their disapproval beginning to show on their faces. In another corner, Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, frowned slightly. She turned to her companion. "She's being so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve that." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. "It seems like his very existence annoys her." The atmosphere in the restaurant started to shift, but not in the tranquil way La Lumière was known for. Emma's words, the quiet observations of the other diners, and Shaq's unshakable calmness created an underlying tension. Meanwhile, Shaq continued to enjoy his moment. He refused to let the whispers affect his mood. Though he knew he was being judged, he felt no need to justify himself. At the Carters' table, Mr. Carter sighed softly, his gaze still resting on Shaq. "The world is a strange place," he said, his voice warm but tinged with disappointment. "People forget that someone's true worth isn't in their appearance." Mrs. Carter nodded in agreement, but both of them understood that the evening's drama was far from over. Emma, after hearing the murmurs, decided to take her pride to a whole new level. In her mind, Shaq didn't deserve the courteous service La Lumière was known for, at least, not from her. Turning her back on him, she grabbed her notebook and began attending to other tables as if Shaq didn't exist. She stopped at a central table where a wealthy couple was sipping red wine. Flashing a radiant smile and using her sweetest voice, she leaned in slightly. "Would you care for another bottle of Margaux 2015? It pairs perfectly with the main course." The couple nodded, and Emma quickly jotted down the order, throwing in a few playful remarks to extend the conversation. But her eyes kept darting toward Shaq's table, where he sat calmly, seemingly oblivious to her deliberate neglect. Emma walked past his table repeatedly, feigning busyness, balancing a tray in one hand, and focusing on another table. She acted as though she hadn't even noticed him. The steady clack of her heels on the wooden floor echoed her indifference. Shaq, a man who had faced fierce competitors on the basketball court, remained utterly composed. His large hands rested lightly on the table, his eyes wandering around the room with an air of quiet curiosity. A small jazz band played in the background, adding to the ambiance, but the tension between Emma and Shaq was far from over. The soft jazz music in the far corner of the restaurant filled the space with a soothing atmosphere, a gentle contrast to the growing tension at one particular table. As the song ended, Shaq clapped, a warm, resonant sound that brought smiles to the band members' faces. His applause, though seemingly simple, caught the attention of nearby diners, their curiosity piqued. How does he remain so calm even when it's clear he's being treated unfairly? The question lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniably present. From the counter, Emma frowned. The polite smile she wore for other customers had vanished, replaced by a scowl of irritation. Shaq's composure unnerved her far more than she had anticipated. Inwardly, she began to suspect he was doing it on purpose. Why doesn't he say anything? No complaints, no demands for service, just waiting, patiently, as if he had all the time in the world. Determined to push him further, Emma devised another plan. She approached a newly seated table and began an overly detailed explanation of the menu, fully aware that this would prolong Shaq's wait even more. Every extra second she wasted elsewhere was another second he sat there, ignored. At another table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter had been watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Carter leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's obviously giving him a hard time. He's been waiting for at least 20 minutes." Mr. Carter sipped his wine, his sharp eyes locked onto Emma's movements. "I see it. But what's intriguing is that he doesn't seem bothered. He's waiting, but not just for the food. I think he's waiting for something else." Shaq remained seated, glancing at the artwork on the walls, the sparkling chandelier overhead, as though the restaurant itself fascinated him more than the drama unfolding around him. His unshakable calmness didn't just frustrate Emma, it exposed her unprofessionalism for all to see. And yet, she was blind to it, so focused on asserting dominance that she failed to notice the shift in the room. As she walked past Shaq's table once more, Emma deliberately turned her back to him and spoke loudly enough for a colleague to hear. "Sometimes, I think certain people don't understand that not everyone belongs here. It's amusing to watch them try." Though her words weren't directed at him, their target was obvious. Several diners exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to quiet disapproval. At another table, Lisa, a young entrepreneur, could no longer stay silent. She set down her wine glass, her fingers curling around the stem. "She's awful," she muttered to her companion. "I don't understand why this restaurant keeps someone like her on staff." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." Lisa tilted her head, studying Shaq. "He seems so confident. But I hope the manager steps in soon. Letting this drag on is just unfair." Nearby, an elderly woman, Mrs. Hamilton, sat with her granddaughter. Observing the entire exchange, she placed her teacup down with a soft clink. "This is disgraceful," she said. "Staff are here to serve, not to judge." Her granddaughter, wide-eyed, leaned in. "Do you think he's going to do anything? He's just sitting there." Mrs. Hamilton smiled knowingly. "His silence is the answer. People who know their worth don't need to prove it. That girl is digging her own grave." Meanwhile, Emma continued her charade, fully unaware of the growing unrest in the restaurant. She spent extra time at the central tables, engaging in excessive conversation, purposefully diverting attention from the injustice she was perpetuating. When she finally neared Shaq's table, she once again ignored him, speaking loudly to a colleague. "This is why we need higher standards. Not everyone belongs here." Shaq simply glanced at her. He didn't need to respond. His silence, his very presence, was enough. Mr. Carter turned to his wife, his voice low but firm. "We need to speak to the manager. This isn't just unfair, it's ruining the experience for everyone." Mrs. Carter nodded. "I hope he doesn't leave before this is resolved. He deserves respect." By now, the quiet tension in La Lumiere had reached its breaking point. The atmosphere was no longer the tranquil elegance the restaurant was known for. It had become something else entirely, an unsaid confrontation waiting to erupt. Emma, smug in her perceived victory, failed to notice the growing resistance around her. Finally, after an agonizing wait, she walked toward Shaq's table, holding a silver tray with the filet mignon ricini, the restaurant's signature dish, priced at $350. Her movements were slow, her high heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, a deliberate performance designed to capture attention. As she approached, she placed the plate down with just a bit more force than necessary, a barely veiled act of contempt. The faint clink of porcelain against wood echoed through the room. Her cold smile returned. "Enjoy your meal," she said, voice laced with mock politeness. Shaq looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with an easy grace, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card, the kind that required no limit, no questions, no hesitation. He placed it on the table, letting it rest atop the receipt tray, and finally spoke. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "But I think I'd like to speak to the owner now." Emma's smugness faltered, her confident posture stiffening as whispers erupted around the restaurant. The trap she had so carefully set had just been sprung, and not on Shaq, but on herself. The soft hum of conversation and the gentle tunes of live music filled the restaurant, creating a soothing ambiance. In the far corner, Shaw sat quietly, his presence understated yet commanding. When the song ended, he clapped, his applause warm and resonant, drawing the attention of both the band and the surrounding diners. His reaction, simple yet genuine, seemed to intrigue those nearby. How could he remain so composed when it was clear he was being treated unfairly? At the counter, Emma's polite smile for other customers had vanished. Her irritation grew as she observed Shaw's unwavering calmness. It unsettled her in ways she didn't expect. Was he deliberately ignoring the subtle jabs, or was he genuinely indifferent to them? Her frustration gnawed at her, and she decided to push the limits further. Instead of addressing his order, she turned her attention to a newly arrived group, offering them an exaggeratedly detailed explanation of the menu. Each moment she delayed, she stole glances at Shaw, expecting to see a flicker of impatience, a shift in posture, anything that would suggest discomfort. But he remained unbothered, his gaze moving leisurely around the restaurant, taking in the artwork on the walls and the sparkling chandelier above. At a nearby table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter exchanged concerned glances. Mrs. Carter leaned in and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's giving him a hard time on purpose." Mr. Carter took a measured sip of his wine, his sharp eyes fixed on Emma. "I see it," he murmured. "But what's interesting is that he doesn't seem bothered. I don't think he's waiting for the food. He's waiting for something else." Emma's patience wore thin as she continued to skirt around Shaw's table, making sure to turn her back to him whenever she passed. Loud enough for a colleague to hear, she muttered, "Some people don't understand that not everyone belongs here. It's amusing to watch how hard they try to fit in." Though the words weren't directed at him, their target was clear. A few diners exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. Lisa, another guest, could no longer hold back her anger. Setting down her glass, she turned to her friend and said, "She's awful. I don't understand why the restaurant keeps her on staff." Her friend, watching intently, responded, "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." The prolonged delay had transformed the situation into a tense performance. Shaw's calm demeanor became the focal point, exposing Emma's unprofessionalism with each passing second. Yet she seemed oblivious, convinced that she was in control. But in reality, the room had turned against her. The tension grew heavier, though not from loud commotion. It was the silence that made the situation unbearable. Emma finally relented, striding toward Shaw's table, carrying the silver tray with a $350 filet mignon Rossini. The deliberate click of her heels against the wooden floor punctuated the moment, drawing every eye toward her. With a forced smile, she placed the plate before him, her tone edged with something between mockery and challenge. "This is what you ordered. I hope you can appreciate it." Shaw, ever composed, glanced at the dish before meeting her gaze. His response was warm, devoid of malice. "It looks delicious. Thank you." Emma's smile tightened. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but making sure he could hear the bitterness laced within. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I'm guessing it's your first time." A flicker of something unreadable crossed Shaw's face before he simply smiled and nodded. "Thank you for the advice." Instead of humiliating him, Emma had only succeeded in embarrassing herself. Lisa, unable to contain herself, whispered to her friend, "She's still trying to be condescending, and he just keeps politely shutting her down." Nearby, Mr. Carter chuckled under his breath. "She has no idea who she's dealing with." Emma, desperate to regain control, added, "If this doesn't suit your taste, we have simpler options. Feel free to order something else." Shaw's response remained unwavering. "I'll consider it." With that, he began eating, savoring each bite as if he were dining in complete solitude. Around him, the whispers of discontent among the diners grew louder. Emma clenched the tray in frustration, storming back toward the counter. She slammed the tray down, startling her colleague, Jake. "He's just pretending to be polite," she hissed. "I bet he doesn't even know what he ordered. People like that only come here for attention." Jake frowned. "Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner. Isn't that our job? To serve everyone?" Emma spun on her heel, her expression twisted with disdain. "Can't you see, Jake? He doesn't belong here. And I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill." But fate had something else in store. From the reception desk, Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, emerged. His polished demeanor carried an air of authority. He walked swiftly toward Shaw's table, concern etched on his face. His presence alone silenced the murmurs around the room. When he reached the table, he gave a respectful bow. "Shaq, it's an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay. We had no idea you were coming tonight." The words sent a shockwave through the room. Conversations halted. Eyes widened in disbelief. Across the restaurant, Emma stood frozen, her face draining of color. "Shaq. Did he just say, Shaq?" Her mind reeled. A young couple nearby whispered excitedly, "That's Shaquille O'Neal. He's a basketball legend and a major businessman." Another diner added, "And a philanthropist. How could she not recognize him?" The realization spread like wildfire. Those who had watched the scene unfold now turned their eyes toward Emma, their expressions laced with judgment. She gripped the tray tighter, as though it could shield her from the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. "Mr. Thompson turned toward Emma, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Shaq, still composed, picked up his glass, took a slow sip of water, and then looked directly at her. He didn't need to say a word. The moment was already more powerful than any reprimand could be. Lisa shook her head in disbelief. "She's ruined herself." Mr. Carter smirked slightly. "He doesn't need to raise his voice or demand anything. His presence alone speaks volumes." Shaq finally broke the silence, his voice gentle yet commanding. "No worries. Everything is fine. But perhaps I'd like to have a brief chat with your team after dinner." Mr. Thompson nodded instantly. "Of course, Shaq. I'll arrange it right away." Emma's breath hitched. The ground beneath her felt unstable. What she had intended as a lesson to humiliate someone she deemed unworthy had become her own downfall. Every judgmental glance, every hushed whisper, was a mirror reflecting back at her. The reality of her actions settled in. She had made the mistake of believing that power lay in belittling others. But true power had just shown itself, in quiet dignity, in restraint, and in the ability to command respect without ever demanding it. Emma stood frozen, feeling as though every bit of air had vanished from the room. The murmurs around her, the stares of the patrons, and the heavy silence from Shaq left her unsure of what to do next. A rising tide of confusion and fear welled in her chest, but there was no escaping the situation she had created for herself. Shaq set his glass of water down on the table, his gaze fixed squarely on Emma. His eyes did not carry anger, but the sternness within them was enough to make her feel utterly exposed. He leaned forward slightly, his deep, steady voice carrying a quiet authority. "Miss Emma, what do you think about how customers should be treated?" Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out right away. She stammered as if the words were breaking apart in her mind. I didn't know who you were." Shaq shook his head slightly, his brows furrowing. His voice rang out clearly, each word cutting through the tense atmosphere in the room. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity." His words echoed like a bell, awakening a sense of clarity not just in Emma but throughout the entire restaurant. Some patrons nodded in agreement, while others murmured among themselves. But it was evident that Shaq's words were meant for everyone. Emma felt her legs grow unsteady. She tried to respond, but every word seemed stuck in her throat. Finally, she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. "But you're not like other customers." Shaq leaned back in his chair, his gaze remaining firm but not overly harsh. He spoke slowly, letting each word sink into Emma's mind. "It's precisely because I'm not like other customers that you need to learn to treat everyone the same. Respect isn't something you reserve for people based on how they dress, how they speak, or how they look. It's the most basic thing every person deserves." Emma lowered her head, her hands gripping the edge of the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't respond, couldn't justify herself. Every action, every word she had spoken earlier in the evening replayed in her memory, now haunting her. From the central table, Mr. Carter gave a subtle nod and whispered to his wife, "He doesn't need to raise his voice or assert his authority. What he said and how he said it was enough to teach that girl a lesson." Lisa, seated nearby, raised her glass of wine but didn't drink. Her gaze rested on Emma, her disappointment plain to see. "She'll probably remember this lesson for the rest of her life. I just hope she truly changes." Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. His voice was firm but not unkind. "Emma, I think we need to have a talk after your shift. But first, let me handle this situation." Emma didn't respond, only nodded faintly, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. She stepped back, trying to hide her face, flushed with shame and fear. Shaq watched her retreat for a moment before turning to Mr. Thompson. His tone softened as he said, "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it is. I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't meant for Emma alone, but they resonated through the entire restaurant. Some diners bowed their heads in reflection, while others nodded in agreement, acknowledging the truth in what he had said. Shaq picked up his knife and fork and resumed his meal with an air of calm, as though nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant knew that this calm was not indifference, it was a lesson. Delivered with weight and significance. From a distance, Emma could feel the eyes of everyone still on her. Her actions tonight would not simply fade into the background of her job but would become a turning point in how she saw people and the responsibilities she bore. Shaq set down his knife and fork, gently dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and slowly rose to his feet. The entire room seemed to freeze. Every eye, from the diners seated at their tables to the servers standing by, turned toward him. No one dared to speak. The stillness was broken only by faint murmurs in the distance and the soft clinking of wine glasses. Shaq's gaze swept across the room. His face was calm, but his piercing eyes radiated confidence and solemnity. When he finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice carried a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very air. This restaurant was founded to welcome everyone, no matter what they look like or where they come from. That's the philosophy the founders, myself included, have always believed in. He paused, his eyes moving from one face to the next, ensuring his words landed with their full impact. Then he continued, "Unfortunately, today we failed to uphold that belief." The words struck like a gong, awakening a collective sense of accountability. The tension in the room thickened. Some diners lowered their heads, avoiding Shaq's gaze, guilt etched on their faces for standing by silently and doing nothing. A few nodded subtly in agreement, though their embarrassment was unmistakable. From the center table, Mr. Carter gently set down his wine glass and shook his head. "It's shameful. He's right, we let this happen without saying a word." Lisa, seated at a nearby table, leaned forward, her eyes brimming with admiration. "He's not just addressing the staff. He's speaking to all of us." Shaq pressed on, his voice steady but imbued with profound sincerity. "The world we live in is riddled with prejudice. We judge people by their appearance, by the clothes they wear, the way they speak, or what we assume they have or don't have. But I believe places like La Lumiere must be different. This is not just a place for the wealthy or the powerful, it is a place where everyone should feel welcome." He paused again, his eyes settling on Emma, not with accusation, but with a look of encouragement. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Emma, still standing in the far corner, lowered her head. Shaq's words were like a spotlight illuminating the missteps she had made that evening. She knew there was no excuse that could sufficiently explain her actions, and the weight of every gaze on her was a silent reminder of her responsibility. Shaq turned, addressing the entire team of staff. His tone softened, but his resolve was unshakable. La Lumiere is not just a restaurant. It's a place where we build relationships, not based on wealth or appearances, but on respect and understanding. If any of you forget that, we don't just fail ourselves, we fail the customers who trust us to be better. Some of the staff hung their heads, shame evident in their expressions. Jake, who had silently witnessed everything, nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a newfound respect for Shaq. Shaq's gaze shifted to the diners, and his voice grew stronger. "This isn't just about the staff, it's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to create a better space. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and I believe, the responsibility, to speak up. Silence, sometimes, is complicity." His words rippled through the room, touching every heart. Some diners bowed their heads, ashamed of having chosen silence in the face of what had happened. Others looked up at Shaq with newfound admiration. Lisa, unable to contain herself, began to clap softly. Her applause was like a spark, and within seconds, the entire room joined in. Mr. Carter nodded in agreement and joined the applause, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Shaq raised his hand gently, signaling for silence. He turned to Mr. Thompson, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of worry and gratitude. I believe we can do better, Shaq said, his voice now calm yet resolute. I'd like to meet with the entire staff after closing tonight. It's time for change. Mr. Thompson nodded, his voice filled with respect. Of course, Shaq. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We'll make it right. Shaq sat back down and resumed his meal, as if the powerful speech that had left the entire restaurant in thoughtful silence was nothing extraordinary. But it was clear that no one in the room would forget the lesson he had just delivered. In the corner, Emma felt the weight of shame pressing on her shoulders. Yet, beneath the embarrassment, a new determination began to take root, a resolve to change, to become better, not just for the job, but for herself. When the last diners left the restaurant, Lumiere sank into a rare quiet. The staff gathered in the main space, forming a circle around Shaq, who stood at the center with a calm yet commanding presence. The light from the chandelier above reflected on his face, highlighting the seriousness and sincerity in his gaze. Shaq scanned the group, his eyes moving from Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, to each member of the staff, including Emma, who stood at the edge of the circle, her head bowed as though trying to avoid his gaze. His voice was deep and steady, each word carrying weight. Everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us. How we correct them does. He paused, letting his words sink in. A few staff members nodded slightly, as if recognizing that his words were meant not only for Emma but for everyone on the team. Shaq continued, his eyes sweeping across the room. This restaurant is not just a place to eat. It's a space where people come to experience something special, to feel valued. Our responsibility is to ensure that anyone who walks through those doors feels welcomed, regardless of how they dress, how they speak, or how much money they have in their wallet. Emma, standing at the far end of the circle, felt as though his words struck her directly in the heart. Her eyes began to glisten, and she bit her lip, struggling to keep herself from breaking down. But she knew she couldn't avoid this forever. Shaq stopped speaking, his gaze finally settling on Emma. There was no anger, no disdain, only sternness tempered with trust. Emma, he called her name, his voice softening but still firm. Today has been a tough day, not just for you but for everyone here. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Emma looked up, her eyes red and watery. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room awaiting her response. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I'm sorry, Shaq. I was wrong. I let my own biases blind me, and I failed in my responsibilities. I truly regret it. She took another deep breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't realize that respect isn't about how someone looks. I understand that now, and I promise I'll change. Shaq nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gentleness and encouragement. That change is for you, Emma, not for me or anyone else. Change is a process, and I believe you can do it if you truly want to. His words weren't just for Emma, they resonated with everyone in the room. A few staff members nodded subtly, as if acknowledging that they, too, needed to rethink their perspectives and actions. Shaq took a step toward the center of the circle, his voice dropping lower but growing even more resolute. This restaurant isn't defined by fancy tables or expensive dishes. It's defined by people, by how we treat each other and our guests. And if we don't do that with respect and compassion, nothing else matters. The room fell silent, with only the soft sound of breathing filling the space. Mr. Thompson, standing beside Shaq, spoke up, his voice full of gratitude. Shaq, thank you for your words. We will make sure our team not only learns from this mistake but truly changes, so that Lumiere becomes a place where everyone feels welcome. Shaq nodded, his eyes showing a hint of relief. He looked around the room one last time before concluding, now is the time to start fresh, stronger and better. I believe you all can do it. Emma wiped her tears, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted but also as though she had been given a new opportunity to make things right. In Shaq's gaze, she saw no resentment, only a glimmer of hope. And that made her all the more determined to change. That night, as everyone left the restaurant, not only Emma but the entire team at Lumiere understood that this wasn't just a lesson for their work. It was a profound lesson about how to be better human beings. The glass door of Lumiere gently closed behind Shaq, leaving the elegant space behind. As the lights dimmed, the brilliant glow of the Beverly Hills streetlights illuminated his towering figure, highlighting each deliberate yet graceful step he took on the sidewalk. The stillness of the late night enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the faint rustling of the trees and the distant hum of passing cars. Shaq walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the street ahead while his mind lingered on the events that had just unfolded. He thought about the restaurant, about Emma, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed tonight's moment. It wasn't just a lesson for one person, it was a lesson for everyone, including himself. He took a deep breath, his lips curling into a faint smile. A thought echoed in his mind, powerful and clear, just like the words he had spoken during the meeting earlier. The world needs more kindness. True strength isn't in judgment but in acceptance. And it's the small daily choices that define who we are. Shaq knew tonight's lesson wasn't just about handling customers, it was about how we perceive each other. Beyond biases, beyond appearances, to see the true value in people. He thought about Emma, who had made a mistake but showed genuine remorse and a commitment to change. To him, that was far more meaningful than any reprimand or punishment could ever be. Memories of his time on the basketball court suddenly came rushing back. He recalled facing criticism, the hasty judgments people made about him simply because of his playing style. He remembered how patience and calmness had helped him rise above it all. And tonight, he saw a similar moment, not on a court, but in a restaurant. As Shaq rounded a corner, the glow of a neon sign reflected off his face, accentuating his confident and composed demeanor. He knew that his actions tonight weren't about showcasing power or proving anything. They were about setting a standard of respect, of kindness, and of understanding. And as he walked away from Lumiere, he knew that was the kind of legacy worth leaving behind. As Shaq walked away from La Lumiere, the soft glow of the restaurant's windows cast elongated shadows on the pavement. He paused for a brief moment, glancing back at the dimly lit establishment, now silent after the evening's events. The air carried the remnants of laughter and conversation, but what lingered most was the lesson imparted, a lesson not just for Emma or the staff, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Change, he thought, doesn't happen overnight. It starts as a seed, planted in moments like these, growing with each conscious choice we make. He continued down the street, the distant hum of Beverly Hills nightlife filling the silence. He hoped that the events of the evening would not simply be another fleeting incident, forgotten with the dawn. He wanted it to be more, a turning point, a catalyst for reflection. Emma had made a mistake, but she had also recognized it, embraced the lesson, and vowed to change. That, to Shaq, was the most important part. People weren't defined by their missteps, but by how they chose to correct them. Kindness, he mused, wasn't about grand, sweeping gestures. It was about the small, consistent choices made every day. The decision to treat a stranger with dignity, to show patience instead of frustration, to listen instead of dismiss, these were the moments that shaped a person, that shaped a society. True change wasn't built on force or anger, it was nurtured through understanding, through the willingness to see beyond assumptions and stereotypes. His footsteps were steady, each one carrying him further from the restaurant but not from the lesson itself. The road ahead was long, stretching endlessly into the night, much like the journey of change he had spoken of. It wasn't enough for La Lumiere to uphold better values within its walls. The real challenge was carrying those values beyond the restaurant's doors, into daily interactions, into the way people viewed and treated one another. Tonight had been more than just a discussion about customer service. It had been about humanity, about the responsibility each person carried in shaping a world that was fairer, kinder, and more compassionate. Shaq had always believed in leading by example, whether on the court or off. Tonight, his lesson had been simple but profound. Respect should never be determined by status, appearance, or wealth. It should be a given, extended to all, unconditionally. As he rounded a corner, the neon lights from a nearby storefront reflected against the smooth pavement, casting vibrant hues against his silhouette. He thought back to Emma's tearful realization, to the staff's silent nods of understanding, to the guests who had witnessed the moment unfold. Change had started tonight. Not just within Emma, not just within La Lumiere, but within everyone present. He knew that change wasn't always immediate, nor was it always easy. But he had faith in people's ability to grow. After all, he had seen it happen time and time again, both in his own life and in the lives of those around him. Mistakes would be made, but what mattered was how people responded to them. Would they retreat into defensiveness, or would they acknowledge, learn, and do better? That was the question he hoped everyone who had witnessed tonight's events would ask themselves. And he hoped their answer would be the right one. The lesson of La Lumière was no longer just confined to the walls of the restaurant. It was now something bigger, a message, a reminder that respect and compassion should be the foundation of every interaction. The smallest acts of kindness held the power to dismantle prejudice, to bridge divides, to heal wounds unseen. Shaquille O'Neal had once been known for his dominance on the court, for his towering presence and unshakable strength. But tonight, his greatest strength hadn't come from physical power, it had come from patience, from understanding, from his ability to inspire change without raising his voice. True leadership, he knew, wasn't about demanding respect, it was about demonstrating it. As he walked on, disappearing into the quiet hum of the city, the glow of La Lumière remained behind him, a beacon of hope, a symbol of transformation. And somewhere inside, Emma stood a little taller, ready to step into tomorrow as a better version of herself. Because in the end, that was all anyone could strive for, to be better than they were yesterday. What do you think of tonight's lesson? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where kindness shattered prejudice? Share your story in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories. See you in the next video.